This is the section on airworthiness, part number 1. Yay, FARs! Boo, FARs. Why do pilots need to know about certification requirements? Effectively, so it's because you need to be able to decide whether or not the airplane is going to be airworthy. And there's a lot of federal aviation regulations that will bite you in the butt if you don't know what they are and pay attention to them. Now, you've probably gotten a great education at the ground school, at the flight line, but I want to make sure I reiterate a few things and cover a few things that go beyond airworthiness requirements for little airplanes. We're going to talk some about airworthiness requirements on jet aircraft as well. Of course, there's a lot of federal aviation regulations. You'd be surprised how many people can't spell federal aviation regulations on the test. All the FARs, I think there's 198 of them. They're not all used up, but there's like 1 through 198. Are all part of the Code of Federal Regulations, Subpart 14. Subpart 17 has to do with copyright issues. So if you want to burn a music CD, you need to make sure you understand Code of Federal Regulations Part 17, which has U.S. copyright law in it. Part 14 is the part that has federal aviation regulations in it. The Code of Federal Regulations are federal laws, and therefore, since FARs are part of CFR 14, that makes the FARs mandatory, and the FAA can fine you and suspend your certificate or revoke your certificate if you're a naughty pilot. The part of the FARs that we're going to talk about a little bit in this section are Part 21. If you want to build a component like an ELT or tires or brakes or wheels, anything that goes on the aircraft that's airworthy except for propellers, airframes, and engines have to be certified under Part 21. I like to call it the certification of pieces and parts, or parts and pieces, because that's kind of a nickname for AS356 parts and pieces. If you want to build a small aircraft like ON-72, you have to comply with FAR Part 23 if you want to certify small airplanes. If you want to certify an airplane, build an airplane and mass produce it and have it used as a transport category aircraft under FAR Part 121, that is for an airline, then that airplane has to be certified under Part 25. Of course, you've heard about airworthiness directives, and I'll talk a little bit more about it on another slide, but FAR 39 covers airworthiness directives. FAR 43 and 91, interestingly enough, if you look in your FAR book, FAR 43 is there, and it's FARs for pilots, and you're going, wait a minute, FAR 43 is for maintenance. Well, you got a good point there. It does say, however, that anyone doing maintenance has to comply with FAR 43, and guess what? There are privileges and limitations for pilots and their ability to do a certain amount of maintenance, preventative maintenance, in FAR 43, so we're going to cover a little bit of FAR 43. Effectively, FAR 43 is to airplane mechanics what FAR Part 91 is to pilots. If you go fly an airplane, you got to fly well enough that you don't violate Part 91, as when a mechanic is working on an aircraft, they have to do their job well enough so that they're not violating Part 43. Now, you've probably read, I'm sure you've read lots and lots of FAR Part 91, and the first half of it, the vast majority, is how well you have to fly, but that's not the part that we're going to cover in this class. We're talking about certification requirements, about making sure the airplane is airworthy, not how to fly it. So we're going to talk about that second half of Part 91. Starts around 91.200 and goes up into the 91.500s. And that's the things that says, when do you have to do a 100 hour? When do you have to do an annual? When do you have to have an ELT inspected? What things on the airplane can be broke and you still get to fly the airplane? It's that second half of 91. There's a couple of things at the beginning of 91 we'll look at here shortly, but it's mostly that second half of 91 that you might not have looked at very closely that we're going to cover in this class to make sure that you can determine whether or not your aircraft is airworthy and is safe to fly. Like I said shortly a minute ago, FAR 121 is the rule, the regulations that cover scheduled air carriers, or the airlines. Part 135 is air taxi operators, or sometimes called unscheduled airlines. If you go to a fixed base operator and you want to give them $500 so they'll fly you in a twin engine airplane to Vegas, so whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and then you fly back and you want to go whenever you want and you're not going to do the flying, that would be a non-scheduled air carrier, or a charter operator is also another term for air taxi operators. That's under 135. Now, flight schools, almost all of them in the United States, are certificated under 141 right now. Embry-Riddle at Prescott has has some certificated under 141 and some under 142. You don't have to be a certificated flight school to get flying lessons. You just need a certified flight instructor and an airworthy aircraft, and away you go. But a lot of flight schools get their curriculum approved by the FAA, and the FAA approves them under FAR 141 or FAR 142. You probably heard of that. But there's another one in the 140s, 145. That's repair stations. If you want to fix aircraft, you don't have to have a mechanic certificate to start a repair station. I'll give you a couple examples here. Let's say you're working in the military, you worked at the Air Force Academy, you've been working on their airplanes, and it's they have some piston engine airplanes there, and all you do is overhaul magnetos. You fix engine magnetos. You get out of the service, you don't have a mechanic certificate, but gosh darn it, you're really good at magneto repair. So you go to the FAA and you prove to them, you show them all the tools you have, all the maintenance manuals, all the equipment you have, and an inspection process on how you're going to make sure that everything gets done right. And you can get an FAA repair station under FAR 145, an air agency certificate approval as a 145 repair station, but it'll have a limitation on it. It'll say on a piece of paper, and you have to post it, what you can do. And of course, it'll just say you can remove, replace, or fix and overhaul magnetos, and then that's it. You can't do anything else. Somewhere in the middle of a medium-sized repair station might be Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University Prescott. We have a repair station. You don't have to have a mechanic to work for us, although we do tend to hire airplane mechanics because they have a lot of training. And we get approval from the FAA as a repair station. We got to prove we have trained personnel, prove we have equipment, prove we've got the right maintenance manuals, prove that we have a good inspection program. So that if somebody does the work, somebody will come behind them afterwards and check it, make sure it's done right. And it'll say, like, we can work on unpressurized airframes, and we can work on all kinds of piston engines. And we also have, in our repair station, we can do some instrument work and some avionics work. So we can do a lot of our own instrument work and repair and work on our own radios. And it's going to say all the things we do on our air agency certificate. On the far end of the spectrum, away from just overhauling magnetos, might be United Airlines. They might fly 10 different kinds of airplanes, 12 different kinds of engines, and they're going to say that they can work on all kinds of turbojets and turboprops and engines and hydraulic pumps and alternating current generators and a plethora of different kinds of aircraft components. And that may have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages of limitations listing all the different things they can do. And one thing that's really nice about having a repair station is that you can hire people without mechanic certificates. Let's say you were working in the U.S. military working on jets for 20 years. You never got your power plant mechanic certificate from the FAA, but you're a great jet mechanic. United Airlines can hire you without a mechanic certificate because you're a trained person. So that works out really well for airlines. In fact, I've never even seen a 121 airline unless they also didn't have their own 145 repair station. There's 4 different, I guess not organizations or people because they're not all people, that can fix flying machines. The original manufacturer, Cessna, gets to fix Cessnas. Lycoming gets to fix Lycoming engines. Macaulay gets to fix Macaulay propellers. Garmin gets to fix Garmin GPSs. Cleveland makes brakes and wheels. They get to fix their own brakes and wheels. So if a manufacturer made something, they get to fix it. Also, if you have a mechanic certificate, an airframe and or power plant mechanic certificate, or an A and P mechanic certificate, then you can work on airframes and power plants. If you are a certified repair station under 145, you can repair anything that's on your inside of your limitations on your air agency certificate. And then we're going to talk about it in a different lecture. If you have a private pilot certificate or higher, under the right conditions, you can do preventive maintenance on an airplane. Like you can change the engine oil in the filter, you can change the tire, you can clean out the spark plugs, you can service the battery, you can paint some of the airplane, you can redo the upholstery on the inside. There's quite a list of things in FAR 43 Appendix A that you can do as a private pilot. So these are the 4 entities that can fix flying machines. Okay, what about getting your airplane certified? There's type certificates, and then there's production certificates. There's an old saying in aviation: how do you end up with a small fortune in aviation? It's by starting out with a large one. I'll give you an example. You start out with $2 million, had this great idea for a new airplane. So hire a bunch of engineers to come up with data to prove to the FAA that this is a safe airplane design. You build one or two prototypes, you fly it around, you fix a couple of things here, the FAA tells you to fix a couple of things there, and you demonstrate to the FAA that this design is safe. If somebody built it, it would be a good airplane and you could get it certified. Whenever you're building an airframe or an engine or a propeller, you have to prove to the FAA that it's a safe design. That's a type certificate. So you spend $2 million getting your aircraft type certificated or getting a type certificate for it. But now you ran out of money. So you sell it to somebody for $1 million. They have $2 million, and their other $1 million, they get a production certificate. A production certificate is kind of like a repair station. You have to prove you have trained personnel. You got to prove you have the equipment and facilities to do the work. You got to have all the engineering data from the type certificate, and you got to prove you have an inspection program set up so that as you put the airplane or the engine or the propeller together, somebody comes behind the first person and checks to make sure it got done right. If you can demonstrate to the FAA that you can do all these things in a production line, then the FAA will give you a production certificate. Now that you have a production certificate, essentially proving that you have what it takes to mass produce a bunch of these airframes, engines, or propellers, now you can mass produce them and you can sell them as a certificated aircraft engine or a propeller. But that is technically a separate system than the type certificate. Now, big aircraft manufacturers like, let's say, Piper or Cessna, they have the type certificate and they have the production certificate, and they didn't buy the type certificate from anybody. But they could sell the type certificate to somebody, but then they would have to generate a production certificate separately. So you got to get a type certificate to prove it's a safe design, and then in order to mass produce it, you're going to have to get a production certificate. In both cases, you got to prove this to the FAA. Now that you've done that, you get to type up, as the manufacturer with your production certificate, you get to type up the airworthiness certificate, that half-page white paper with blue and black ink on it, and stuff it into the aircraft when you sell it. And essentially, that certificate is stating that when that aircraft left the factory, it was built exactly like the type certificate data said it was supposed to, and at that moment when it leaves the factory, now they're gonna push it out the door and fly it around a few times, make sure, tweak a few things, make sure it's good. But when they hand you the owner's certificate or the bill of sale and you fill out the registration and you buy it brand new, that airplane is perfectly airworthy right smack at that moment. It's just like it just had an annual or progressive. The ELT has been inspected. The altimeter static system is good. All those inspections, there's no airworthiness directives on it. That airplane is essentially perfect and airworthy at that exact moment. Yay! I love perfect airplanes. I love imperfect airplanes for that matter. Let's say you buy an airplane and you start flying it around and figure out that you wish it would go a little faster. So you try to figure out different fairings you can bolt onto the airplane to reduce less drag. You think, I'd like to put a bigger engine in it so it'll go faster. Or you go from a fixed pitch propeller to a variable pitch propeller. Or you want to carry more stuff in it. Or you want to make the wings longer so it gets better gas mileage or can fly at slower speeds. These are all characteristics that change the airplane for the better. Most airplane, in fact, pretty much no airplane manufacturer will sell you an STC or a supplemental type certificate because they want you to buy next year's model. If they think it's such a great idea, they'll put it into next year's model because they want you to buy the new airplane because they make lots of money. But other people, not the original equipment manufacturer, that's what OEM stands for. OEM is original equipment manufacturer. Pretty much anybody except the OEM does STCs. For instance, out at the flight line, we have a couple of 150-150s. They took out the 0200 that put out 100 horsepower and put in an 0320 that has 150. So that Cessna 150 went from 100 horsepower to 150 horsepower. How do you think it is flying that thing around at sea level? Pretty fun. You could go pretty fast. You could tow gliders if you wanted to. This changes the aircraft for the better. Changes the characteristics for the better. You can put vortex generators on the airplane so it'll stall at slower speeds. I've seen a single-engine Cessna 208 Caravan. They took out the engine, put in two engines, drove one gearbox, and it would spin a big old honking propeller, turned it into a multi-engine airplane. Not a multi-propellered airplane, but a multi-engine airplane. So they did something to the airplane that improved the characteristics. If one engine quit, then the other one would still run and still be able to fly the airplane around. So there's a lot of STCs out there. One STC is an autogas STC. If you have an older airplane that'll run off of 80, 87 octane, you can get an STC to run it off of 87 octane car gasoline, or MoGas as it's sometimes called. One could argue that improves the characteristics of the airplane because it'll burn less expensive fuel. That one's just a paperwork STC. You don't actually have to change anything. Well, I take that back. You have to put a placard by the fuel tank opening that says you can also put auto gas in it. So I think that's enough for supplemental type certificates. Airworthiness directives, or ADs. Just like STCs, nobody calls them Sierra Tango Charlies. ADs, nobody calls them Alpha Deltas. They're ADs, or airworthiness directives. Every single airworthiness directive, they come out every 2 weeks. Every single airworthiness directive is an amendment to FAR 39, and since FAR 39 is part of the Code of Federal Regulations, and the Code of Federal Regulations are federal law, bing, that means airworthiness directives are federal laws. That's why you have to comply with them. That's why they're mandatory. Typically, airworthiness directives are written up and published because there's an unsafe condition on the aircraft. Years and years ago, they had trouble with 172 seat rails wearing out, and when you rotated the airplane, your seat would slide back, you'd hold onto the control wheel, and you'd slide back, pulling the control wheel with you, and the airplane would stall and somebody get hurt. In fact, some people got killed doing that. So usually what happens is the aircraft manufacturer will send out service bulletins saying, hey, you need to fix this problem. But service bulletins under FAR Part 91 aren't mandatory if you don't want to. They're mandatory under 121 and 135. So if people don't fix enough of them and another person has an accident, the FAA tells Cessna, fine, people aren't doing your service bulletin, we're going to make it mandatory, and they'll send it out in the form of an airworthiness directive telling you that something's got to be inspected, something's got to be repaired, maybe there's a part that's no good, you got to take it out and put in a new one. It varies very much. It varies quite a bit by airworthiness directive. It may say you have to inspect it or replace it within so many days, like you get 180 days, or within the next 100 hours, or before the air engine gets 2,000 hours on it, or before the next flight, or over the next 100 flights, or engine cycles, engine startings, in particular on jet engines, they count how many start cycles, or on airplanes that are pressurized, they count how many pressurization cycles, or how many times you put the landing gear up and down. That's a cycle. So every single one is different on when you get it done. If you own an aircraft, they are going to mail you the airworthiness directives that apply to your airframe, engine, and propeller. And if you don't understand what it says, you really need to take it to a mechanic or a repair station and say, hey, here's this airworthiness directive. Does it apply to my airplane? And if the answer is no, the mechanic or the repair station will write in your logbook saying this airworthiness directive doesn't have to be complied with because it doesn't apply to your airplane. But if it does, you got to take care of it. In fact, the FAA, since they're mailing you the airworthiness directives as the owner, they are going to hold the owner responsible if they fly the airplane or they let somebody else fly the airplane. Even though an airworthiness directive was supposed to have been done, the owner is definitely going to get violated. Also, mechanics and repair stations, when they do 100 hours or annual inspections or progressive inspections like we do at the flight line, every time that progressive inspection or that 100-hour or the annual gets done, the mechanic or the repair station is signing it saying, I certify I have inspected this aircraft in accordance with a 50-hour progressive inspection or 100-hour and annual, and certify it to be airworthy. At the moment they sign it, they have checked every airworthiness directive against the airframe, the engine, the propeller, the radios, the brakes, the ELT, the rotating beacon, and there aren't any outstanding airworthiness directives, so they get to sign it off. But it's only perfect at that moment. Now it's up to the registered owner to make sure that anything else that comes in the mail gets taken care of. And I already told you about signing off the inspections there. Now, who's going to get violated by the FAA if the airworthiness directive isn't complied with? Absolutely positive, it's going to be the owner. If they get an airworthiness directive and they don't take it into the shop and get it complied with, and that airplane flies, whether it's the owner or they loan it or lease it or rent it to somebody else, the owner's going to get busted. Okay, if the airworthiness directive came out before the 100-hour or the annual or the progressive inspection and the mechanic or the repair station missed it, they're going to get violated by the FAA if they signed off the inspection. But if they sign off the inspection, say, on August the 25th, and the AD comes out on August 30th, it's not their responsibility to take that airplane. They don't own the airplane. It's the owner's responsibility. Now, you're all probably thinking, well, you know what? I don't own an airplane. I'm not a mechanic or a repair station. What about the pilot? What about the rental pilot, the pilot in command of somebody renting an airplane? Well, the FAA really doesn't want you flying airplanes that have airworthiness directives that are outstanding and haven't been complied with. However, since they're not mailing them to you, it's very difficult for the FAA to violate a rental pilot if an airworthiness directive hasn't been complied with, because they aren't mailed to you, and there's nowhere you can look in a logbook and say, here's this airworthiness directive, because if nobody wrote it in there, it would be blank. So I'm not saying it's legal and safe to fly airplanes without airworthiness directives being complied with, but it's very hard for the FAA to violate a rental pilot. In fact, I'm going to say they can't violate a rental pilot if they flew an airplane without an airworthiness directive being complied with, because there's no good way for the rental pilot to check it. Okay, there in the front part of FAR 91 is paragraph 7 or something like that. It says no person may operate an aircraft unless it's in an airworthy condition. Problem is, it doesn't do a good job of telling you what airworthy is. You look up in the front in part 1 and it doesn't say like there, well, here's this big list of 25 different things to check, and if you check all that, the airplane's airworthy. So this is kind of the catch-all FAR. If you fly an airplane and it's not airworthy for any reason, technically the FAA can get you for it. What is unairworthy? I guess that means the airplane's not safe, for sure, but definitely unairworthy means it doesn't comply with the Federal Aviation Regulations. It also says in the beginning of Part 91 that the pilot in command, the PIC, is responsible for determining that the aircraft is in a condition that's safe for flight. So here's the second paragraph where the FAA gets to pound on the pilot in command, because it's their responsibility for making sure the airplane's safe. Now, it doesn't mean the pilot in command has to do the pre-flight inspection. Somebody else can do it and come up and say, hey man, I did the pre-flight and it's good. It's up to the pilot in command to decide, does this person know what they're doing when they're pre-flighting the airplane. In particular, under FAR 121, under the scheduled airlines, the pilots don't do the pre-flight. They do a walk around, but they don't do the whole pre-flight. They don't stick all the tanks and check all the hydraulic reservoirs. Somebody on the ground does that, but they sign it in a maintenance record that's in the airplane. We'll get to that in a later section. But it's still the pilot's still responsible for making sure that stuff got done. If you want to fly an airplane or a helicopter or a glider or a balloon or a dirigible or heavier than heavy lift aircraft, and you want to do it with something that's broken, you get to do that. But there are some certain restrictions that you have to follow to make sure that the airplane is airworthy and safe, and a lot of that's included in FAR 91 in the sections 200s. You're already familiar with a bunch of this stuff. There's a list of things you got to have on the airplane and be working, or on the aircraft and be working. To go VFR day, you got to have a compass, airspeed indicator, altimeter, engine RPM gauge, oil pressure, oil temperature, like that. And none of those things can be broken and still go if you're VFR day. If you go flying VFR at night, on top of the things you need for VFR day, you also need a few more things like position lights and an electrical source of power, something like that. And under IFR, you got to have everything you need for VFR night. Plus, you got to have a directional gyro, an attitude indicator. You got to have two-way radio communication. You don't have to remember anything on those lists for this course. You can look them up whenever you need to. But there's also more things under Part 91 that, depending on your type of flight, you got to have on board the airplane. For instance, if you're going to operate for hire, you have to have an operational landing light, and that includes paying a flight instructor. A paid flight instructor is operating for hire under Part 91. You got to have operational DME equipment above flight level 240, and there's it's a very convoluted paragraph. It's really big, takes up like a page. You got to have an operational ELT. There's a few exceptions where you don't have to have one, but it's in FAR Part 91. The things you got to have in order to fly under certain conditions. So that's one place you would have to look. Now, if you want to fly with things that are broken, there are 3 different ways to get that done. You can either use a checklist that's in Part 91, you can get an approved minimum equipment list, which we'll talk about here shortly, or you can get a special flight permit, which also I'll tell you about here shortly. Okay. You want to go out to the airplane, and you go out to the airplane, you're pre-flighting it, and the cigarette lighter's broken. You still want to go flying. You can use FAR 91, it's in the 200s, and you can use this part in the FAR, to legally fly an airplane, even though something is broken. I call it my 4 checks plus 3 actions found in FAR Part 91. You have to check 4 things, and then you have to do 3 things And then if all of these things are good, you can go fly the airplane. You've heard of this before, so I'm going to go over it pretty fast. First, you got to make sure it's not required by FAR Part 91. Is it day VFR? You don't have to have a gyro. If you're above flight level 240, you got to have a DME. If you're operating the aircraft for hire under Part 91, you have to have an operational landing light. So there's several places in FAR 91 where you're going to have to look to see if it's required. You're also going to have to look in the approved flight manual. In the back of the approved flight manual, the vast majority of the time, there's a list of components that have to be on the airplane and working under certain conditions. You have to comply with it as well. You're going to need to check to see if this component is required by an airworthiness directive. Now, this is extremely uncommon, but what I find rather interesting is that if you have a turbine-powered aircraft, and you have a NiCad battery, there's actually an AD about a temperature indicating system for the pilot. And there's an AD that says every single aircraft that has a NiCad battery has to have a temperature gauge for the NiCad battery, because NiCad batteries can have a thermal runaway and get too hot. But most of the time, this is the least likely one that you're going to check and have something be a problem. You also have to check and make sure that if this component is inoperative for this flight, it's not going to be a hazard to the aircraft. Like if you're flying day VFR from Prescott to Kingman, you think it's okay not to have a gyro. I think it's okay if it's day VFR to Kingman that you don't have a directional gyro. It would not be a hazard. So if you check all these things and they're not required and it doesn't make it hazardous to operate the aircraft, then you either have to deactivate the component or you have to remove it. Unfortunately, this is a maintenance action, and so is placarding it. You have to put a placard next to or on top of it, and it has to say inoperative. And I'm not talking a yellow sticky. It's got to be something permanent. So that way, if somebody else operates the airplane tomorrow and they don't pre-flight it as well as you, they'll easily see this placard saying that it's inoperative. Like if it's the directional gyro and they're going to go fly IFR, the gyro is required by FAR, and I'm sure it's going to be required by the approved flight manual, and one might consider that not having a directional gyro flying IFR would be hazardous. You definitely want other people to know, so that's why you're going to have to put a placard that you deactivated the component or you removed it, is so that they'll know the next time they fly the airplane that something's wrong with the airplane and they need to pay attention to it. And since both of these two items are maintenance, you have to write it up. An airplane is unairworthy when you do maintenance until you record what you did in the maintenance records. Now, the problem with this is most of the time this takes a mechanic to do this, since your privileges under Part 91 as a pilot don't have very many things that you can fix. So most of the time, in order to do this, you're going to have a mechanic come out and deactivate or remove it, placard it, and then write the maintenance in. Now, there's another way to be able to fly the aircraft when something's broken and be legal, moral, and ethical. And that's having an MEL. I'm not talking multi-engine land. I'm talking minimum equipment list. Minimum equipment list. Minimum equipment list is also described in FAR Part 91 in the 200s. When you first get an airplane brand new out of the factory, the manufacturer will come out with a master minimum equipment list, an MMEL. But it only has the things on it that the manufacturer installed. Let's just say that it's a Lear 65. That's a big old honking $30 or $40 million business jet, and it comes out of the factory and it's green. They haven't even put the paint job on it. It just barely has minimum flight instruments and radios. They fly it to some place where they're going to put the interior on it and put a paint job on it, and they install a blender and a DVD player and a computer and a hot tub and a vibrating bed and another blender, and they install all kinds, a gold-plated toilet seat. They install all kinds of other stuff on it. So this master minimum equipment list doesn't have everything on it. So what you're going to do, as soon as you put all that stuff in the airplane, to have that all installed, you're going to write up an MEL, a proposed MEL. You're going to write up a proposed MEL, and you're going to send it to the local FAA office, the FSDO, and they're going to look at it, and you're going to write on it, if the DVD player is in op, you're going to say that day VFR, night VFR, or IFR. If it's busted, it's okay to fly. You're going to put everything on the aircraft that you installed, the VCR, the DVD, the vibrating bed, everything that you put into the, if the toilet doesn't flush, it's still okay to go flying. You're going to write up in there everything else that's on the airplane, in addition to everything that was on the master minimum equipment list. So now you get it approved. When you get it approved, then they are going to give you a letter of authorization, and you're going to keep that in the airplane in the same binder as the minimum equipment list. Now that's what it's going to be called, the minimum equipment list for that one particular aircraft. When you're writing it up, you're going to take into account anything that it says you got to do in FAR, anything that's in the approved flight manual. You're going to check any ADs that might apply to the airplane. You're going to make sure that it's not hazardous. And you're going to take all this stuff into account when you write that MEL up, and the FAA is going to approve it. So now you're going to keep the letter of authorization, and you're going to keep the minimum equipment list on board the aircraft. When you go out to the airplane and you pre-flight it, anything that's busted, you're going to write it up. That piece of paper that you write it up on is part of the maintenance records. You're also going to look at everything else that everybody else wrote up. See, part of an MEL is it's going to tell you what you have to do in order to go flying, and it may not say you have to placard it. So that's why you're going to write it down, and that's why everybody else is going to write it down. So there's in the aircraft, as part of the maintenance records, is what's broken on the airplane, so everybody that flies the airplane can now know what's wrong. So now you've got a list of the stuff that you find is inoperative, the stuff that everybody else found is inoperative, and you're going to read the MEL and see what does it say you can do. If it's single pilot and there's a directional gyro on the co-pilot side that's busted, it's probably going to say you can go flying even IFR because you don't need to look at it. If the DVD player is broken, I think it's going to say it's okay to go flying. Also, if it has an O, then it tells you that the operator can take care of it. That means the pilots. If it's got an M, that means you need maintenance. Essentially, you got to have a mechanic come out and take care of it. These four things right here are the four things you're going to have to do. If an airplane has a minimum equipment list approved for the aircraft, you have to follow it. And you're going to have to be legal, moral, and ethical, make sure that the letter of authorization and the MEL is on board the aircraft. Make sure that you write down anything that you find wrong. Make sure that you look at the list of other things that have been found wrong before you got there. And then you have to follow the MEL limitations, restrictions, whatever it says you can or cannot do, you got to do it. I have an example here of a Boeing 777 minimum equipment list. I know it's probably really small and hard to read, but right here it says if the engine fuel filter bypass warning systems, it says there's 2 installed and you got to have one that works. And M right here says maintenance has to do something. So 1 may be inoperative provided fuel, blah, 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 blah. So it's a little bit lower. Whoops, went too far. A little bit lower. Wow, this one's pretty rough. Here it says maintenance, M, and then it lists all these steps that a mechanic is going to have to take in order for you to be able to fly the airplane. However, whoops, I got another one. Here's a different one. Here's for the electronic engine controls, EEC, normal mode. If that's busted, there's 2 on board the airplane. 0 of them have to work if you want to get dispatched, if you want to go flying, and the remarks is O. O means the operator. So it says norm mode may be inoperative provided both engines are operated in the alternate mode, and dispatching with an engine anti-ice valve inoperative is not open, is not permitted, and the low pressure turbine case airflow systems on both engines have to be operating normally. And of course it says right here you have to note notification dispatch is required. So if it says O, then that means the pilots can take care of it. And if it says M, then that means maintenance is going to have to take care of it. You're going to have a mechanic come out and help you with it. And they're going to have to do something. Okay. Also in FAR Part 91, back in the 200s, it says if it's a turbine-powered airplane, so it could be a Piper Malibu or a Piper Meridian that's got a Pratt & Whitney PT6 out in the front. It says you can never ever use that 4 checks and 3 actions method from FAR 91, which means that you're going to want to get an MEL. And of course you can use the MEL, but let's say that the airplane is brand new and you haven't gotten the MEL done yet, and the DVD player breaks. Even though it's not a safety of flight item, you can't use the 4 checks and 3 actions methods and go, well, it's not required by an AD, the FARs don't require it, blah, 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 it won't be hazardous, we'll mark it inoperative, we'll deactivate it, and we'll get it go fly. Nope, sorry. If it's a turbine-powered airplane, you can't use this system under Part 91, which would mean that if anything on the airplane broke at all, if there's no MEL, if anything broke on the airplane at all, you're grounded. You can't fly. So guess what people are going to do who buy turbine-powered airplanes? The very first thing they're going to do is they're going to get their MEL approved immediately, and they're going to write up all the little things on the airplane that might possibly break so that they can fly the airplane without being stuck somewhere. However, interestingly enough, this 4 checks and 3 steps, 3 actions out of FAR 91 can be used on turbine helicopters. Now, special flight permits. You can get a special flight permit on any flying machine. Typically, they're only issued so that you can fly the aircraft someplace to get the appropriate maintenance or inspections done. Say you have a ranch out in the middle of Paulden and you've got your own private little airstrip and you go out to pre-flight the airplane and something's busted. You can't get any airplane mechanics out there to come fix it, but it's probably going to be okay to fly it one time into Prescott. So you get a flight permit from the FSDO. You got to have it in writing. They might be able to fax it to you, but you got to have that special flight permit with you when you fly, and it's going to have a restriction on it. It's almost always going to say only required crew members can be on board the aircraft. It's almost always going to say you can only fly day VFR. It might have a restriction that you can't fly over congested areas, and it'll give you a time frame. It'll give you like a 3 or 4 day period. From this date to that date, you can fly from this one airport to Prescott Airport for the purposes of getting this maintenance done. They aren't going to give you a special flight permit so you can go overfly the Grand Canyon and show your friends and stuff like that. So they're only going to issue it to you pretty much if maintenance needs to be done and you can't get it done where you're at. And it's got to be issued in paper, on paper. So the special flight permit, you've got to have that with you, and that technically makes the airplane airworthy. It's also called a ferry permit, F-E-R-R-Y, so you can ferry the airplane or get the airplane to a place, or helicopter to a place where you can get the maintenance done. If you have any questions about this section, please let me know. Let me know if there's any improvement.